is 1945, and the remote island of Sodor, off the northwest coast of England, has emerged from the fog of World War II, relatively unscathed and untouched.
The island served as a detention camp for Germans living in England. That's how Professor came to be here.
Professor Wilhelm Goetze was born in 1903 in Munich, Germany. A doctor in biology, he became a prominent advisor to the ruling party in the 30s.
Wenn die älteren Jahrgänge noch wanken werden könnten, die Jugend ist uns verschrieben und verfallen mit Leiblichkeit.
In 1939, as war escalated, he, his wife Olga, and 4-year-old son Hans fled the country.
Tja, ich habe nie einen solchen Befehl bekommen. Er hat einmal gefragt, nicht wahr? Am 14. Mai 1942 war der Großadmiral Räder und ich bei ihm.
That's what he wanted people to believe. The fact is, his experiments were hard to stomach even for his own people.
In truth, he had become a prominent figure in the government, but as his work progressed, questions and objections had been raised in the higher echelons of the Reich.
His work with genetics and DNA was truly pioneering, the cracking and manipulating of the human genome. What Professor Goetze was most successful in, however, was keeping his history a secret until his death.
In an attempt to gain favour among the German hierarchy, Wilhelm Goetze was at the forefront of the government's most fanatical policies. In 1938, he was influential in instigating the infamous Sajmelnacht, the Night of Sawdust. But, as his experiments advanced, he became a much less popular figure and soon feared for his and his family's lives.
As soon as he escaped to England, he was banged up here. But locals were nice to him, there was no hostility, and many of them chose to live here after the war.
Following their release, Professor Goetze, Olga and young Hans chose to remain. After studying under his father, Hans left at the age of 18 and went to university on the mainland, studying biology and engineering, writing several pioneering papers about genetics and the splicing of DNA with mechanical implants.
He called it biofusion, the technique of manipulating genetic material to splice with mechanical attachments. However, much like his father, the British government became more and more concerned with Hans Goetze's proposals. So he was forced to seek financial backing from home.
His dad left Germany with quite a few bob, so Hans came back. He saw our little island as some sort of refuge where he could work in peace. Soon every nutcase and eccentric was coming over.
By 1962, Hans had set up Sodor Research, a small lab near the town of Alsborough, but soon the enterprise began supplying medical equipment and machinery, and quickly grew to become a large complex, comprising its own links to the growing Sodor rail system.
Young Abby Collins from the town was working there when Professor Hans took a liking to her. Soon they were married, and not long after, the town was buzzing with news of her pregnancy.
Baby Thomas was born in 1968. Throughout the early years of his life, he would watch the growing railway network with fascination.
He couldn't get enough of trains. His dad bought him one of the first video cameras, and he'd be on the platforms every day. You can see he was friends with everyone, even that simple bloke who could only say where he lived.
Sodor.
But his favourite trains were the old steam engines.
Steam engines were a dying art on the British mainland, like his son, and likes to keep them running for our purposes, or to the mainland to be modern postal express trains.
But as the Sodor rail system expanded, it found itself increasingly under the supervision of the new British rail network and appointed a new controller.
Oi! Get off my f***ing platform!
Sir Topham Hatt. Born into money, he took his ridiculous name to heart and started wearing a top hat all the time. Of course, we islanders had a different name for him.
Fat bastard. You've never met such a cold-hearted as him. He banned all steam engine volunteers and cut most at rail employees, shut down the branch line and the smaller stations. He was happy to let the railway rust away, just like they did to main line.
A stroke of luck for the island that would result from tragedy.
Come on, we're gonna be late.
What's the time?
Thomas, get moving.
Young Thomas loved following railway. He'd be out all the time, hoping to catch a new train on his camera.
11:45's coming through soon.
He won't wait for us.
Unfortunately, he didn't take as much notice of the safety signs.
I'm not being late again.
Have we missed it yet? Wait for the 11:45.
Never mind the 11:45.
It must be late again.
Thomas, come on.
It's always held up.
Hans was mortified. He disappeared from public view and into the labs. Locking himself in, he wouldn't allow anyone in there. Eventually his father Wilhelm came to see him.
In a few days, a major laboratory had been locked down, followed by an engine maintenance shed, which was to become off limits to all.
All production was shut down, orders weren't met, but the two Professor Goetzes didn't care. More and more equipment was being delivered daily, but no one was allowed in Shed 17.
Questions started being asked on Sodor. Where were the Goetzes? Would there be no funeral for young Thomas? And where was the body?
They'd arranged for Thomas to be transferred to a mainland hospital. He'd been taken to the complex but was never moved by rail. We all assumed the obvious, he was still in lab.
But if Thomas was there, was he still alive? And what was the purpose of keeping him at the complex? Almost a year after the accident, the doors of Sodor research were reopened.
Moment to realise what it was I was looking at. One woman passed out as Thomas smiled at us.
Hey, are you alright, Keith?
Sodor Island.
They kept trying to interview me. I became a bit of a celebrity.
Questions asked about science ethics.
It's fair to say I was pretty nervous on a brave face.
What did you think when you first came to meet Thomas the Tank Engine?
Most of my mates said I looked pretty good on telly. Awkward questions.
Good evening. An act of mercy or a crime against humanity? I am joined now by...
Even when some of the questions got difficult, I made sure I knew what I was talking about.
What was your reaction when you first met a talking tank engine?
If you can't make an informed opinion, or if you can't string together two words on telly, well, maybe you shouldn't be on there.
There are two sides to this.
Admittedly, the subject matter was a bit bizarre sometimes.
There are some dark forces at work here.
You were alright as long as you could win over the audience.
See this, they're laughing at you. They're not laughing with you.
The Goetze family refused to answer any questions.
Thomas's DNA had been reprogrammed to accept and adapt to the engine structure, using the engine's internal system to maintain his organic function. Professor Hans and his father vowed Thomas would never work on the railways.
Similarly, the two professors were to refuse many requests by people from around the world who wished to be biofused into engines.
There were billionaires offering to pay whatever they wanted to be converted into an engine or some other transport. Train enthusiasts too, and people with terminal illnesses were desperate to be made into trains. But for some reason, the Goetzes refused.
But there would be other interested parties, eager to seize on the biofusion goldmine. The independently wealthy Topham Hatt staged a hostile takeover and within weeks had bought a controlling share in Sodor research.
Immediately, the policy of the company changed, and so did the ethics. The medical supply wing was shut down, and work began on mass biofusion experiments and operations. Anyone who could afford it, some handing over their whole fortunes, were turned into engines.
But, along with the new policy, there would be worse to come. Biofused engines would be allowed, then obliged to work on the railways.
The first one we fired up was James. Experiment further, or to take massive risks like this. It was horrible watching these engines work on the railways some days.
Edward was first to have problems. He'd been filming all day for the kids on the platform.
Sadly, this was only the first in an increasing number of incidents.
Harold had an obsession with aircraft and had paid to become a helicopter. The operation had gone well, but we had to ban him from being allowed to attempt flight.
In an experiment kept secret until now.
It seemed fine.
Everything organic in the engine. Harold was never told why he couldn't fly, but the decision would keep him alive, if only for a little while longer.
In fact, unknown to the outside world, there had been many failed biofusion experiments.
That fat bastard kept the accidents a secret, and legal disclaimers had to be signed by anyone being biofused. So there'd be no legal action taken if anything went wrong.
And were too ill to work, or were already dead.
They had to put a stop to all the troubles the other engines had.
Sodor Research began selling the technology to other countries in multi-million-pound deals and immediately resigned.
Professor Wilhelm couldn't come to terms with what was happening to his engines, and took the only course he thought he could take.
That fat got a load of us rail staff over to his house to clean up after the body was taken away. You should have seen it. Sawdust everywhere. It took us days. Gordon paid an enormous amount to be Sodor's first 462 config.
We were shocked to discover he had insisted on being able to work on the railway. So, one night, after the regular staff had finished for the day, fat engine.
As usual, these experiments were filmed. This footage has never been broadcast before.
Dr. Ruth and I filmed it all.
It might be a bit shaky. It was handheld.
He wanted to see what would happen.
He argued he had put a lot of work into Gordon.
I wasn't as near to him as some of them.
The fateful few hours following the accident would seal the fate of Sodor Research.
The fat stopped us trying to put out the fire, insisting that any evidence would fall back on us. They're going to die unless we do something.
Finally, someone suggested we airlift them to hospital. Harold was banned from flying for his own safety, but we thought the risk was worth it.
Fueling Harold was a nervous experience.
We all breathed a sigh of relief and loaded the injured people aboard. Then it all went wrong.
Harold's engine had worked fine, but what no one realized was most of Harold's lower extremities were permanently fused to his propeller system.
As Harold's rotor blades began to spin, vital organs would be drawn into the motor and tear him apart from the inside.
Well, now there was no covering it up. The smoke could be seen all morning, but news people were here in an instant. We were told to close gates and start clearing up the mess ourselves, with some help.
He was called into the yard to help tidy the mess. Working mostly at night, he would...
We had to work quickly and quietly, the sea. Then one night, the points were set wrong, and we were diverted to another shed.
Henry had inadvertently been sent to shed number 17, where Thomas had been biofused into a tank engine, and had subsequently been declared out of bounds.
It was dark, and these sheds all looked the same. I unlocked the doors and Henry rolled in. I didn't see what...
Keith locked the shed up without seeing what was inside.
They talk about that shed. More than our job's worth.
That night, he arrived at the railway controller's office.
The fat had a new job for him. That old line was treacherous at best, but when Henry was...
Fish had started being delivered by road to the mainland, declared redundant.
That fat shite always hated Henry, away from the other engines. Of course, that fat had changed quite a few of their facts.
They couldn't know the points from the...
The points had diverted them to the adjoining siding.
Injuries. Slowly.
Ice and snow caused the accident.
These images from a train spotter's camera were taken the evening before and were successfully covered up by the Sodor Railway Board for 10 years.
There was a railway spike in points, blocking them. Of course, that had disappeared by the time we got there.
I'm sending you to Crewe.
Crewe. We all knew what that meant.
They'll give you a new shape and a larger firebox.
Metal yards in the UK capable of handling and recycling.
As news got out about Henry's accident, it didn't take long for Thomas to...
Small amount of burning fuel in his firebox, but he was mostly moving under his own strength. All closed vehicles, the world had had, but nearly every operation since had failed. Sadly, Thomas found the reasons inside.
He hadn't even been second.
What shed number 17 contained was evidence of several attempts to create a tank engine with Thomas's DNA. Early tests made by people with no experience of an experiment on this scale. Missions made over the 12 months
and experiences. He had learned what Thomas had learned.
Wilhelm and Hans Goetze had had to learn through trial and error how to bring their Thomas back from the dead. Craft that it who he wasn't.
Really useful.
金果同蔬菜抵達碼頭。
Next week, Cockleshell Bay. In the aftermath of the Mr. Ship inquiry, we ask, how much did ITV know? And where next for Robin and Rosie
fucking Warren fucking
of Cockleshell Bay.